Now, women's rights in Islam. Okay, stereotypes are quite common. You already know them. And a lot of the sources actually come from cultural practices. The Taliban have already been mentioned. And then, of course, we've got people like Osama bin Laden. 9/11 was not a media event. 9/11 really actually happened. And the people that are associated with that are people that are claiming Islam. There is terrorism around the world that is occurring in Islam. So these are not media events. So Muslims are also responsible for their own stereotypes, but the media tends to only, of course, focus on that dimension. Now, feminism in Islam, I was asked to speak a little bit about this. And feminism in Islam as a moral philosophy was actually established, believe it or not, 1,400 years ago, which is why a lot of Muslim women feminists, like myself, if they want to gain their right, if they feel that their rights are being are being oppressed or are not being fulfilled, they can actually go back to the sources. They can actually go back to the Quran, they can go back to the Hadith and make their claims, which is an amazing thing to have. I don't have to go anywhere else except for the Quran. When I first started the organization, I would often be told in the mosque, sister, you should be home, married, pregnant, having kids, join the women's committee. And, naturally I would say, what do the women's committees do? In a mosque or in a church or in a synagogue, because they're the same. Catholic women have, when I talk with them, they have the same experiences, and Jewish women have the same experiences. Well, women's committees clean the house of worship, they babysit the kids, and so forth. And of course, I wasn't going to limit myself to that. I wasn't going to allow anyone to prevent me from manifesting my faith in God in the way that I wanted to manifest that faith. And how did I fight it? I fought it through quoting the Quran, citing historical experiences of women in Islamic tradition. Why? Because these rights were established 1,400 years ago by the Prophet Muhammad through revelation. Rights such as the ones that you see up there. Equal rights in nature. Men and women are considered to be absolutely equal in their nature. They're both created from the same spiritual source. It doesn't say in the Quran that Eve was created from Adam's rib. It says that both of them were created from the same spiritual source. So it establishes their equality in their nature and in their humanity and in their equal access to God. They have the same exact responsibilities. They're both considered trustees of God on earth. And they are both going to be accountable the same way. There's only one heaven, one hell, and they're both going to be accountable the same way. Other rights that were established, and these are usually rights that a lot of feminists are usually concerned with. Right to education, right to employment, and to have a career of her choice, right to own and keep her property, to be heard and to be counted. There are many traditions at the time of the Prophet where women took what is called the bay'ah with the Prophet Muhammad, and they were often consulted. And in fact, as was pointed out in some of the poetry, the Prophet Muhammad preferred the company of women in many cases, but they were heard, they were counted, and participated in all aspects of society. And this actually continued for a period of about 200 years after the Prophet Muhammad. And as has happened with all the other religions, the rights slowly deteriorated as people moved away from the original teachings of Islam. Women, as was pointed out, their arranged marriage is forbidden. Now, does matchmaking happen? Well, that happens all the time. And, the Jewish community can tell you the same thing. Jewish mothers always going to try to marry their son or daughter to another Jew, right? Catholics do the same thing. Well, Muslims do the same thing as well. So matchmaking happens, but it cannot be arranged. It cannot happen without the consent of both the man and the woman. So they right to marriage by her consent, right to provisions from her husband, meaning that her husband is actually required in a marriage to care for not only his spouse, but his children. If a woman works and earns her money, she keeps it. It's her own money. She has no obligation to share her wealth with her husband, which is a very sweet deal. Very sweet. Why? Because a woman doesn't have to become the super female, right? She can have children and decide to stay home and raise the kids, have more children, stay home and raise the kids. Why? Because her family is not dependent on her income when she's not required to share her wealth with her husband. Do you guys get it? So if they're making $100,000 or how much people make in Silicon Valley, it's probably around $100,000. You know, if she's working and she earns $50,000, they're not living on $150,000. They're living on $100,000. And so she's free to go in and out of the workforce. She's not required now to have to rush back to go to work. So it's actually very liberating for women for this particular rule that we have in Islam. Now, can a woman share her wealth with her husband? Of course she can. I do all the time. We only have one bank account. Maybe it's not a smart thing to do, but I do it. My sister does it. She's a physician. Her husband's a physician. But she doesn't have to if she doesn't want to. Negotiate marriage terms, sexual satisfaction. How many other communities do you have this even being addressed? It's actually addressed in Islam. Foreplay is talked about, the importance of foreplay, the importance of not just coming, onto your spouse, but making sure that she wants the intimacy as much as you do, and if intimacy happens, she has to be sexually, and because revelation is also sent to her as well. Both of them sinned. Both of them were taken out of heaven, placed on earth. Both of them asked forgiveness from God, and both of them were forgiven by God. So the concept of original sin doesn't exist in Islam. Both of them, and they both became prophets to their progeny. And the other person that's often cited as having been a prophet is the mother of Moses. Not the biological mother of Moses, but the wife of Pharaoh, who married to a very evil person. She takes Moses and raises him as her own child. And she was a very pious woman who endured being married to Pharaoh. So she's also cited as having been a prophet. So there are two different types of prophets. There are messengers that receive revelation, and they're commanded by God to go out and tell the world. So of the hundreds of thousands, only about 300, in Islamic tradition, only about 300 were actually given the status of messengers. The rest were all prophets. So some classical Muslim scholars believe that some of those were actually women. They're not all men.
Hi, I just want to say thank you for being here today.
You're welcome.
I just finished Reza Aslan's book, No God But God, and there was a portion where he spoke about women in Islam and how there is a paragraph in the Quran that did mention a reference to beating your wife, and he interpreted the word beat. This is what my question is. I guess in Arabic, the word can be beat, protect, or in another meaning. So it has more than one meaning to it, but a lot of people have interpreted it as the violent means. But I did look in the Quran today, a translated version, the Penguin Print Publishing Company edition, and I did see that, and I really want to be open to learning more about Islam, and I see it as many modern liberal friends in Israel who are Muslim, and so I just want to know how, maybe if you could shed some light on me.
On that particular verse. Okay, there's a verse in the Quran that actually deals with marital relations between a husband and a wife, and then that particular verse actually ends with, and if you've done all of these things to reconcile your relationship and nothing else works, then there's a sort of a phrase that talks about beating. And that word has been interpreted in so many different ways by so many different scholars. And the way that it's been understood, and this actually speaks to the interpretation of Quran. Muslims understand that you cannot just read the Quran and interpret from it literally. You actually have to consider what it actually says in the Arabic language, and you have to understand the Arabic language as it was used 1400 years ago, and then the context, the social, historical context of the revelation. And then we also have secondary sources that we have to rely on, which are the practices, the traditions, and the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and then the practices, the sunnah, which is different than hadith for the Muslims that are here, the sunnah, which is how the early Muslims actually applied these practices. So it's sunnah, hadith, and then the Quranic commentary that are used to interpret Islam. Muslims understand that they're not supposed to look at, sort of interpret it literally, as a lot of people do, also in other traditions. And we can look at the practices of the Prophet Muhammad and the early Muslims, and beating of anyone, including children, even animals, is absolutely forbidden in Islam. So it couldn't possibly mean beat your wife. It couldn't possibly mean, you'd have to be really stretching sort of, you know, all of this to think that it's actually beating. Is it abused by Muslims? Yes, by illiterate Muslims, by ill-educated Muslims, by very poor Muslims, by mentally, you know, psychologically underdeveloped, you know, human beings. Yes, and in this country, in this country, we have abuse. I mean, I've read statistics that said either 1 out of 4 to 1 out of 3 women are victims of domestic violence, not only by their spouses, but by their partners. 1 out of 3, or even if it's 1 out of 4, that's too many. Is that because of Christianity, or because of some mental health problems in that particular family? So yes, it happens in the Muslim community, but as far as what Islam says, I can tell you that based on practices, which is how we interpret Islam, absolutely forbidden, abhorrent, it never took place by the Prophet, it never took place by the early Muslims as well. And I think that's what we need to look at, not just what it says in the scripture. Now, my own opinion, why it's there, because men beat women 1,400 years ago, and they beat them relentlessly without a second thought. And I personally believe that that verse was there to deal with the issue, to say that if you have marital problems, you don't go out and you abuse your wife. You have to actually follow certain principles. You've got to get a mediator in there to try to resolve the problem, you know, and so forth. And it goes through the sufras. That's why I think it's in there. And let me tell you, 15 years ago when I read the Quran for the first time in my life, I paused at that verse, like every woman does. It's like, what the, you know? And, you know, thank goodness I had the spiritual sense to sort of move on and to say, God is just. It can't be what I think it is. And sure enough, it isn't, as I learned, you know, as I learned more about Islam.
Hi, I was wondering if Islam addresses simplicity at all. Simplicity?
Simplicity?
Simplicity, as far as materialism.
Absolutely, no, absolutely. But it's okay to be rich as well. You know, it also talks about, you know, seeking wealth and so forth. But absolutely, I mean, that is absolutely preferred over material spending. But it doesn't shy away from, you know, from people that have a lot of material wealth and material gain. But yes, of course.
Hi. What do you think of the argument that the discourse on Islamic feminism was originated by the diaspora outside of Muslim countries? I don't know if you're familiar with Mohisi's work, but that's her argument.
With whose work?
Her name is Mohisi. She's Iranian, and that was the argument that she presented. And I thought it was really interesting that she's saying people such as Saba Mahmoud and like Dila Ahmed are the ones who are generating this discourse on Islamic feminism, and that women within Muslim countries don't self-identify as Muslim feminists.
Right, and they don't because they've never really had to, because of the rights that were given to Muslim women, as I mentioned, in the Quran. And so all they've got to do is actually reference their tradition, their, you know, the Quran and the Hadith and all the other commentary that deals with women's rights. Which is why, I've only started actually, honestly, identifying as a feminist after doing this work. and also dealing with Muslim men in the community. In the beginning. In the beginning, I struggled immensely trying to establish this organization because of misunderstanding by many men in the community on my role, what my God-given divine role was as a female in the community. And so I found myself actually having to sort of reach in the Quran, reach in Hadith, to be able, and I became a feminist. I never thought of myself as one before until I've actually had to defend my rights in Islam. But I'm not familiar with her or her writings, so I couldn't actually speak to that.
I was curious about separation, gender separation in prayer.
Right.
I know it's also in Judaism, but I was wondering.
All right. Men and women are separated when they pray because of the physical nature of the prayer. If you ever seen have you ever seen Muslims pray? It's very physical in nature. They have to bow in submission and glorify God's name, and then they kneel, they put their forehead and their nose on the ground in humility. So a man standing behind a woman as she's doing that is considered to be immodest, which is why the separation happens, but it only happens in the prayer hall. Is it carried over to other aspects of existence of Muslim men and women? Unfortunately, you find it in some of the mosques, mostly for cultural reasons, but not for religious reasons, unless they don't have the proper space for men and women to sort of interact with one another. But it happens in the prayer because of the physical nature of the prayer. And also when I am praying in congregation with other women, I have to touch shoulder to shoulder. Muslims stand in rows, touching shoulder to shoulder. And so for that reason, there is separation. And the men are usually in the front, and the women are in the back. But in other mosques that I've seen in the country where there is space, the men and women stand side by side with a barrier in between in the prayer hall, which makes perfect sense to me. But outside of the prayer hall and the rest of the community center, commingling happens all the time, provided that modesty is observed, a modesty in dress, a modesty in behavior, and so forth. But it's not because women are considered subordinate to men, which is a common mistake. And I don't blame people for actually seeing it that way because they don't know. You walk into a mosque and you see the women behind the men, so the immediate assumption is, well, it's because they're second class. It has nothing to do with that. The way that a man looks at a woman is very different. Men can be sexually stimulated by looking at a beautiful woman in a bathing suit, for example. Whereas a woman has to be physically touched to be sexually stimulated. We're biologically different. I'm sorry? Well, I mean, we're biologically different is the point that biologically we're not different? No, we're not. Okay, well. Well, that's generally, this is the way that it's understood, that we're biologically different. Pornography in this country is huge, a huge multi-billion-dollar industry that is usually, for men. I mean, more men go to pornography than women do, and it's because of that biological difference. A man can actually be sexually stimulated that way much more than men. So that's the idea behind the separation, and in the prayer hall, only in the prayer hall, but not elsewhere.
Do you feel like that should be challenged, though? The fact that that's okay for men to have, I guess, that compensated for, so they don't have women in front of them to be distracted?
Oh no, I don't do it for men. I don't dress this way for men. I do it for my own personal dignity. I mean, I think that this is modest dress is very good for me spiritually.
Right.
Right.
I mean,
But
Yeah,
it would
but-
also apply to prayer. It would also apply to prayer as well. I mean, me standing in prayer in front of men would be very In fact, I often give presentations, and I actually had a group of people come with me to the mosque, and I'll never forget the day that it was time to pray, and they wanted to observe the prayer, and I started praying. The row of men, and then I stood behind the men and I started praying with the women, and there were men behind me as I was praying, and it was, for me, it was completely uncomfortable to be in the positions that I have to be in front of men. So no, I don't personally, and I think that I'm a pretty assertive, strong woman. I don't think that needs to be changed, or that should be changed whatsoever. Now, if that type of segregation extended to other aspects of my experience in the mosque, that I would probably have a problem with, but not in the prayer hall. And I don't feel that I'm compensating. It's for me not comfortable to pray in front of a man, bowing and then kneeling with him standing right behind me. So I don't do it for men. I don't do anything for men.
Sorry, we have another question over here, and just a reminder, please phrase your questions as questions, and I can come to the mic and you can speak so everyone gets a chance.
Actually, this is not a question, but I would like to salute you for designating yourself as a feminist, because I think that's really awesome. And also, I would like to say that the technical definition of feminism is the promotion of human rights and the promotion of everything, and not just about women being first or women being the best or anything like that. So I think that it's extremely good that you've put yourself out there as a feminist and who you are, and you've done what you do, and you haven't changed that. And I think that any feminist who tells you that you shouldn't be, wearing what you're wearing obviously doesn't know what feminism is. So, yeah.
A couple of years ago, Amina Wadud led a mixed gender prayer in New York, which was pretty controversial. And I think actually there were no mosques that were willing to support the prayers they actually did to the church. What is your opinion about women leading mixed gender prayers?
That's a great question. Amina Wadud is a professor. I actually do know something about her, and I've read some of her books, some of her writings. She is quite a prominent scholar and a very legitimate scholar as well, and she's also an Arabist. So she knows the Arabic language to be able to do interpretation. And she decided to lead the prayer of not only men, but a mixed gender prayer. This is where men and women were actually standing together side by side, which was an interesting event that happened in the Muslim community, and it was very much condemned, I think, by a lot of Muslims. I was one of those women that really wanted to see her argument for doing what she was doing. I was actually looking for something that she would write that argued her case based on Islamic law, based on precedents, because it hasn't happened. They do cite one particular scholar that did allow it for a particular family where a woman led the prayer in her family because there were no suitable men to lead the prayer. And so there were men that actually followed her in prayer. And that's the only one that I believe they actually say. But I was looking for a scholarly argument that she would make, and I never saw one. I saw other people trying to make the argument for her case, but I never saw it from her, and I was expecting that. And I am one of those women, feminist, who is also an Orthodox Muslim. So if you're going to change the law, do it by making an argument. And allow me to make my own decision based on the argument that you make, but none was offered by her, and I still don't have. Now, she did come out with a book just recently that I just bought, and it has jihad, gender jihad or something. The what? Inside the Gender Jihad that I just bought. So, and I think that she probably makes her argument there, but I haven't read her argument. But at the time that this was happening, there were many people like me that thought it was interesting, thought it was really courageous and brave. And I've always felt that it's okay for a woman to give the khutbah, to give the sermon. But leading the prayer of men, I don't want to do that. And I don't define my power in the Muslim community based on whether I lead the prayer of men or not. I have more important things to worry about, like making sure that women have adequate space in the mosque, that women are a part of governing boards of mosques. I'd rather work on those issues than just to stand up and lead the prayer of men, because I don't get my power from that. But for her, that was very important. And she did it, and I know it's very unfortunate because I think she lost a lot of credibility, and she's a brilliant woman. She's a brilliant scholar. I've always followed her, and I continue to do that. But that was my concern, is that she never really argued it. And if you're going to change the law, just like here in the legal system, you don't go out and do something and claim, hey, that it's legal, and if it's wrong, you're going to be held accountable for it. And the way that we change law in this country is, through trials and lawyers making arguments, and then a decision is made and so forth. She didn't do any of that. She just bypassed all of that as if it didn't matter at all. And so I think a lot of people also saw it as being really arrogant. That's not the kind of feminism that I'm interested in. I'm interested in the kind of feminism in changing these types of things that are pretty much, part of tradition. If you're going to change it, do it the proper way through making those arguments, which she was qualified to do, but she also lost credibility, unfortunately, in the process. So.
Hello. I may be misunderstanding what you've just been saying, but you made it sound like, to me anyway, that it is against Islamic law for a woman to lead the prayer. And if I am understanding that correctly, why is that so? If women are supposed to be equal?
It's only, women can lead the prayer, but they lead the prayer of women. But they don't lead the prayer of men for the modesty issues that I talked about.
I'm just not familiar enough with the prayer practices of Muslims.
Oh, okay.
During the leading of prayer, is the woman at the front?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So the woman is in the front, or whoever's leading the prayers in the front. I'm assuming that you know how Muslims pray. You do? Okay, so you've seen how Muslims pray.
Sorry, I didn't know that the leader of the prayer has to be in the front facing.
Yes, instead of the front. Okay, so this is an argument that she could have made. And this is an argument that me and a lot of my friends thought about. Well, what if she led the prayer from the back? What if she led the prayer in front of women congregation and put the men in the back? Which is, an interesting idea. What if she led the prayer in front of the women and put the men in another room or somewhere else? So there's a lot of things that could have happened, that could have been discussed, but none of that took place. It was, I'm going to lead the prayer, and I'm going to do it in mixed gender. This is where men and women are now touching each other, and they're supposed to be sort of in a state of piety as they're doing that. And this is only one form of prayer, by the way. Muslims have many different forms of prayer. There is the supplication, there is, dhikr, remembrances of God. So there are many different types of prayers that men and women do together all the time. And women can lead, making dua, for example, making supplication. A woman can lead that. But it's the structural, it's called salat. It's the structural form of prayer. Because of the physical nature, a woman can't lead the prayer of men, but she certainly can lead the prayer of other women. And she does, depending on the school of thought that she belongs to. Not all schools of thought actually have
it. First of all, I'd like to salute you as well for coming tonight. I thought your performance was absolutely phenomenal. My question to you is, Arabs and Muslims alike tend to be very proud of where they came from, including myself. Now, whether I'm from a country or a pair of territories really makes no difference as of right now. So my question to you is is it conflictual to be a nationalist and a Muslim at the same time? In other words, is nationalism forbidden in Islam?
Not at all, not at all. It was never forbidden, and love of country was never forbidden. The general principle in Islam is that everything is permitted unless it is very specifically prohibited. Everything is permitted unless it's specifically prohibited. And nationalism is not one of those things that have been prohibited. Love of country is, perfectly permitted, and as long as it doesn't go overboard, of course, and it doesn't supersede your love of God, if you're a Muslim. But there is no conflict between the two. So I can be an American, and I can support American causes. Not all of them, not all American foreign policy. I can be, but being critical of American policy is also good for America, and this is part of the democratic process in which we live. But I can be fully American and enjoy being an American, and at the same time, that's not in conflict with me being a Muslim. So it's not prohibited.
I'm just wondering, what's the difference between how is the Nation of Islam different from, I guess, conventional Nation of Islam?
The Nation of Islam is a group that falls outside of the fold of Islam in their beliefs. It's a nationalistic group. This is the way that a mainstream Muslim views it, but historically it's been a nationalistic group that started in the early 1900s, founded by a man called W.D. Fard. And he was followed by someone called Elijah Muhammad. Where it went astray was that W.D. Fard actually declared himself God incarnate. And so that took him outside of the fold of Islam. Elijah Muhammad became a prophet of God. That's another belief that completely is outside of the fold of Islam. Muslims believe in the finality of the Prophet Muhammad that lived in the 6th and 7th century that I mentioned earlier. And they also believe in the supremacy of one race over another, which is also very much antithetical to the teachings of Islam. So Muslims actually consider that particular movement, which is almost defunct now. Farrakhan, who is the head of the movement now, has reverted to Islam. So he's declared his shahada, meaning that he declared his belief in La ilaha, there's no God but God, and that Muhammad is a messenger of God, referring not to Elijah Muhammad, but the prophet that lived in the 6th and 7th century. But he's done that before many times. He's gone back and forth many times. But the group now, I don't know how many numbers it has as its followers, but it's almost a defunct group. So the Nation of Islam would fall outside of the fold of Islam. Unfortunately, in this country, because there's so little information about Islam, throughout the last 20 to 30 years, I think a lot of people confuse the Nation of Islam with the rest of Islam around the world, with Orthodox Islam. And so when Farrakhan would make his very hateful remarks towards Jews, very anti-Semitic remarks towards Jews, I think a lot of people in America viewed them as being typical of Islamic views towards Jews, for example, which of course isn't the case at all. So the Nation of Islam falls outside of the fold of Islam.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, it's actually not really a question. I just wanted to give you lots and lots of respect and love for coming up here. Because I know, I'm just sitting here and I'm thinking about how problematic this dynamic is, that you're sitting here with us and answering all of our questions. And I know how offended I am when people ask me about where I'm from and ask me to explain myself. So I'm just sitting here and I'm just like, really taking in what you have to say. And I think that I'm a feminist studies major here. And I think that the feminist studies department has a lot to learn from feminism and Islam. And I really appreciate you coming out here and talking and answering our questions, because it means a lot of Muslim students don't have to be in that position. Because we should all have a responsibility, like not to, objectify somebody in this way. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you. That's a beautiful end.
Alright guys, this brings us to our close for the night. But I just want to leave you guys with some words before we leave. I just want to let you guys know that we'll have these tables going on for the next 15-20 minutes, so make sure you check them out. We're going to do a drawing for the raffle tickets, so if you have those raffle tickets, make sure you wait over here. We're going to pick prizes for all you guys. And I just want to say one more thing. I just want to say we're here tonight. You know, we're all blessed to be here. We're all, you know, a lot of us UC Santa Cruz students, but we also have to remember the struggle is international, and that we have to think about women all over the world. I recently read an article about a woman in Afghanistan, my parents' homeland, right here. But sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. Excuse me. There was, in the mosque, the mullah was having a sermon about killing this woman, about getting rid of her and, like, you know, and killing her while she was outside of there having a meeting with women, trying to get an education group going on with them. She walks through every single one of those men while they're praying in that prayer, and she stands in front of the mullah and tells him and recites him five verses of the Quran against what he was preaching. She used the religion itself, she used the Quran itself, and this mullah, who was the spiritual leader of the mosque, puts his hand on her head and says, "God bless you, child, you changed my ways, and forgive me for what I have just told you." Just think about that. I just want to leave you guys on that note. You know, this religion is a religion that can be used, you know, to fight for the women's rights. We don't have to look outside of it. We can find it within our own book, within our own religion, within our people. So I want to thank you guys again for all coming, and make sure you click on the